Because what you don't know about energy can kill you. Here's Alex Epstein.
Welcome to Power Hour. I'm your host, Alex Epstein. I'm joined today, as usual, by Don Watkins in Pennsylvania. Hey, Don.
Hey.
And Stefan Henna in Germany. Hey, Stefan. Stefan, are you there?
Hello, yes.
All right. I thought, well, it might be that I thought there was a wind or solar outage, actually, which my usual suspicion whenever power flickers or there's any unreliability. Okay. So I looked at the stories you guys have for today, and I'm interested in getting to as many of them as we can. There's a lot of interesting stuff going on, and a lot of insight I think we can add to these issues. So let's start off, Don, with your first story.
Yeah, so the UN just released a new report, and the kind of high-level summary of it, according to the New York Times, is that humans are transforming Earth's natural landscape so dramatically that as many as 1 million plant and animal species are now at risk of extinction, posing a dire threat to ecosystems that people all over the world depend on for survival. And the kind of conclusion that's drawn from this is that this is a major threat to human beings. And so the Times quotes an ecologist saying, we need to build biodiversity considerations into trade and infrastructure decisions the way that health or human rights are built into every aspect of social and economic decision making. And I think a couple reactions to this. One is I have not gone line by line through the entire report. In fact, they haven't released the detailed report yet. This is just a summary. But in general, these kinds of the sky is falling claims, I'm a little skeptical going into them just because this has happened for over 60 years that we're just told there's some emergency. The solution is to stop human progress by limiting human freedom. And typically what happens is, whether it's acid rain or the ozone disappearing, is you get the problem either never actually emerges or turns out to be completely minor. And part of what I think is really revealing or interesting about this report is that the whole conception that they have is that human beings are essentially dependent on nature, or at least that it ignores or minimizes the fundamental need to transform nature that we talk about. And so this is just one example of many. I mean, this really runs throughout the report, this idea that we are taken care of by nature and now we're trashing what takes care of us. The New York Times says, in passing, wetlands purified drinking water. And it doesn't even raise or acknowledge the major thing that has purified water, and in fact made it possible for us to have clean water for billions of people, and that's human action, including the use of fossil fuels. And I guess that whole perspective of dropping out which human beings' contribution, like if we're hearing that we're destroying the earth and the ecosystems and therefore impairing our own survival, you would think that, okay, human survival, human health, human access to clean water and clean air, these all must be going down dramatically. And yet, as you catalog in the moral case for fossil fuels, and as others have cataloged, like things have actually gotten tremendously better, particularly in the places having the most impact. So I don't want to dismiss every particular claim of this report, but I'm skeptical of the high level solutions because I'm skeptical of the basic approach.
Yeah, when these things come out, it's really as if they were written from the knowledge base of 5,000 years ago, because 5,000 years ago, or maybe even 2,500 years ago, you would rightly think of human beings as very much dependent upon the natural environment, what people will call the ecosystem, or probably more accurately, ecosystems. And it's true. I mean, when there was enough water, then we were more likely to have food. And, when there's a drought, a whole bunch of people die. And when there are storms, you can't really cope with the storms. We were completely at the mercy of and dependent upon the non-human environment. And But then we did something which people will often call industrialization, but we can also call it we created a human environment. There really was no distinctively human environment. There was just human beings and then, the rest of nature. And what we did is we created a human environment that allowed us to have way more resources with way more reliability and then way fewer threats. Um, because we could insulate ourselves from the, inadequacy and viciousness of the rest of nature from the perspective of human life and human flourishing. So when I hear a story like this saying, oh, well, this species is going to die and this is going to do this, and then human beings are just going to be helpless. No, no, no. Human beings used to be helpless when we depended on nature in this way. And then the thing that we should be really worried about is anything that would make us helpless by dismantling the human environment. And the the number one way of dismantling the human environment, the number one threat, is decreasing or eliminating our access to energy, and chiefly through fossil fuels, since that's our main source of access to energy. So we're not in this primitive state anymore, but they're advocating policies that would bring us to this primitive state, but they give nature credit for our advanced state insofar as they acknowledge it. Because if you acknowledge reality, you have to acknowledge, okay, we have an unprecedented level of human flourishing today. Let's understand that. And you cannot attribute that to the beneficence of nature. It's not like, our resources increased 10 or 100-fold because nature became nicer or because the wetlands became nicer. And even by their account, we've supposedly been insufficiently nice to the wetlands. So we should be getting punished. And so they keep having this narrative, oh, well, it's going to get really bad, but because they don't acknowledge the invention of the human environment. If you don't acknowledge the invention of the human environment, you cannot understand human flourishing, and you're going to make really, really destructive policies. So within the context of, if you acknowledge the invention and the glory of the human environment, from that perspective, you can ask, okay, is there anything we're doing in building and maintaining that environment that has long-term threats because, okay, it's doing something to the atmosphere or there's one particular species, but then even then the same means by which we build and maintain the human environment, which is using a lot of technology powered by a lot of energy to make those better. Those are the same basic means by which we would deal with any drawbacks or any negatives. So for instance, if we have an issue with CO2, we'll try to figure out how to capture CO2 or try to figure out a really good substitute for fossil fuels that doesn't emit CO2, or how to how to deliberately cool the planet if we need to. But it's all going to be from the perspective of the indispensable thing is a human environment. Stefan, what's your first story today?
The International Energy Agency reports that renewable energy capacity additions stalled in 2018 compared to 2017. So the report reads, capacity from solar, PV, wind, hydro, bioenergy, and other renewable power sources increased by about 180 gigawatts in 2018, the same as the previous year. So it still grew, but it's not this exponential explosive growth that allegedly is necessary to, bring the world to a zero carbon economy, which is one of the big goals, set out by the IPCC and also I believe the International Energy Agency and many countries and organizations. So
Wait, I have a question about the data. So what's the number figured? Was it in gigawatts or gigawatt hours?
In gigawatts, it's capacity.
So they're just mixing together hydro capacity and solar capacity?
Yeah, that's the aggregate statistic. So they are lumping together all these like biomass and hydro, which are reliable, solar and wind, which are not reliable, and so on.
Do you happen? I mean, because my guess is that there will be more, relatively speaking, solar and wind, which means that less actual capacity is being added.
Yeah, there's actually they have a more detailed breakdown regionally, so I'll get to that. But the issue is that in some areas it grows, in some areas it stalls, and so they are blaming all kinds of things for that. But yeah, of course, solar and wind add a lot of capacity, but they are not actually reliable capacity. So to compare that with something like coal growth or natural gas growth is would be super unfair, because 1 gigawatt of natural gas is of course much better than 1 gigawatt of solar, which only produces like 25% of the time or so. Okay, so the International Energy Agency's executive director, Fatih Birol, said, thanks to rapidly declining costs, the competitiveness of renewables is no longer heavily tied to financial incentives. But that is then later contradicted by, in the same press report, reading that governments can accelerate the growth in renewables by addressing policy uncertainties and ensuring cost-effective system integration of wind and solar. So they're giving this mixed message. Solar and wind and renewables overall are getting rapidly cheaper, and that's where all this growth potential is. But apparently, this doesn't come to fruition. And I find this interesting that the International Energy Agency would sort of blame Chinese solar policy on the decline in installed solar capacity. But at the same time, it says, oh, it's already so cheap, so it gets installed in all these developing countries in Africa and Asia. So it's I think there's more politics in this than empirical, objective empirical information, because what we know is that renewables, in particular solar and wind, which are the fastest growing overall for decades, and those which are supposed to be the highest capacity by something like 2040, 2050, they are mostly driven by policies, by financial incentives, by mandates like the renewable portfolio standards and so on. And this is what drives the capacity increases of these. And as soon as some large manufacturer and also consumer of solar panels like China changes the policy a little bit, the incentives or the tax structure or whatever, immediately you can have a breakdown of the sales of these solar panels. And that's, I for all the narrative that we get about, disruptive technology in renewable energy and so on, we mostly see that this is driven by policies and taxpayer money and mandates by governments, and not by a really competitive energy source.
Yeah, I was thinking the same thing, because you hear the buzzword of disruption. You also will often hear the buzzword of exponential. And it's so interesting that even some, at least seemingly scientific minded people what they'll do is they'll just point to some kind of growth curve and basically say, well, this is going to continue indefinitely. So solar has, it's doubled and doubled and doubled. And so it's just going to keep doubling and doubling. And yet that is just incredibly uncommon, and obviously can't be sustained at all over time. I mean, it's not going to keep doubling every year. I mean, that would be amazing, but it's not going to do that. But just there's this idea that, if there's this early growth, there's an early rapid rate of growth, then that rate of growth is going to just continue exponentially. And that's just not the way things usually work. I mean, you have this phenomenon with Moore's law in terms of processing power. And so that's a remarkable thing. And there's certain reasons why that exists in that context. But just to take any rate of growth of anything and say, oh, this is going to take off. I mean, it's even possible that with failed products, you have, okay, well, it sells very little the first year, and then a little more the second year, and then twice as much the third year, and then, oh wow, we're on an exponential path. And just to assume that, oh yeah, that's gonna work out is super far-fetched. And then if you look at the nature of it, yeah, these are getting installed very strongly correlated with different kinds of incentives. And then you see when a country gets frustrated with them, you see just declining investment. What specifically happened with China?
So China changed the policy, and so sort of the mandate structure on the local level which was a primary driver of solar installments in China. So China is the biggest consumer of solar cells, in addition to being the biggest manufacturer. And that happened last year, and immediately the installed capacity that was originally projected didn't come true. So essentially, it's a central government decision not to install that many solar panels. And the reason in the International Energy Agency report, or in the press release, was that they are trying to cope with the intermittency and trying to integrate the existing solar capacity better. So that's what we have been said before about a cost driver in solar and wind, the intermittency, the integration into the power grid. That's a cost driver. So the price per solar cell or per wind turbine isn't all that relevant for the overall system cost, of course.
All right. I want to talk about a new topic, but a related topic, and it's a question for Stefan. Can you talk about the issue of fires and solar panels at home? You've mentioned this to me a couple times, and I've read a couple articles. I'm curious. I almost never hear it mentioned. I was talking to a good friend of mine last week, and who's pretty savvy in general, and he hadn't heard it mentioned. So can you just talk about this problem that we never hear about?
Yeah, so problem is, of course, relative, because I don't think it's a very common occurrence, similar to, Tesla electric vehicles are not burning all the time. It happens, but it's relatively rare. So when you have a solar roof installation, the problem is that these solar cells are constantly generating electricity as soon as light shines on them. That's how they work. That's a photoelectric effect. And you can't really shut them off. There is no off button or off switch that you can pull and trigger and make them not do that. So even in an emergency, when either there's a fire at the home, or even if the electric installation creates a fire, the problem is that you have a sort of power generating unit on the roof that you cannot shut off completely. And so if the firefighters arrive, sometimes the best option is actually to let the roof burn in a controlled manner, because you cannot just put water on the roof and then have firefighters rescue people inside the house or something. So that complicates things a lot. So there sort of, in experts circles, there are manuals that mention this kind of hazard, that you have electric shock hazard when you put water or foam on the roof of a burning house with the solar installation. So it complicates things, and it can also start fires. I actually don't have a good statistic on about how often that happens, but it's something to consider when you're planning your your roof with a home installation, with a rooftop solar installation. That's definitely something to think about and be aware of.
Yeah, well, in California, they are unfortunately planning what everyone's roof should have with new homes, because they're mandating solar panels, or at least that's the last I heard on the subject. And it's just remarkable how this doesn't get discussed. I mean, it's a serious thing to increase a fire hazard in your home, and yet the cause and effect is fairly straightforward, and yet it's just not mentioned. It's not considered an important story, and particularly, it's even more dangerous if you don't know about it, and yet there's just no interest in the actual downsides of these, because these technologies are so overwhelmingly means of attacking fossil fuels and passing certain policies versus actually accomplishing something good. And there are other things with solar panels. You hear of, or maybe you don't hear of enough, but people who have solar panels, often they will have animals nesting under the panels in different ways, and it'll cause all sorts of noise and all sorts of issues there. And it's just not mentioned. Of course, then there's just the maintenance and the amount of time that people are spending. I remember I had lunch in the last year with somebody who's a very successful finance person, and he's telling me about solar panels, and he had installed them and he was disappointed with the performance, but then he talks about going to dust them and all this time he's spending and all this. And I'm just thinking, you have so much earning power, and yet you're wasting so much time with these stupid solar panels. I mean, this is one of the great things about decentralized power. We don't have to do the maintenance on our power systems, and we don't have to have all of these difficulties. Like, we don't have to worry about the fires involved in generating power, which tend to be a bigger deal than, when you're dealing with all kinds of power. You're more likely to have different kinds of accidents, so it can be good to be away from them. And yet there's none of these benefits are mentioned. So it's the existing power system. The grid has tons and tons of advantages, and when we're talking about different kinds of alternatives, certainly when you're encouraging individuals to adopt them, let alone mandating that they adopt them, there needs to be honesty, not just this fantasy of, oh, the everything is wonderful. I think I remember Bill McKibben had some line, and I cannot. He said there's no such thing as like a solar spill. It's just a sunny day or something like that. Well, like, okay, but under the right circumstances, you can with a sunny day, that can cause a very destructive fire that could cause your house to burn down. That could cause more people to get injured than would have otherwise gotten injured. Also, this reminds me, Stefan, I think you had a point. We got to go into this. There's somebody who's been writing me for the past year or so, an interesting guy named Mark Rausch. And writing and sort of trolling, there's a little bit of overlap because he's just been kind of writing publicly. But I do want to get back to him on some of his claims. And his basic idea is that there is basically that ethanol got screwed over in some way that prevented it from being the leading energy source of civilization. And that if only it hadn't been for some sort of conspiracy a long time ago, then ethanol would just be everywhere. But I think he had some line, Stefan, correct me on this, but it's something like, if we spill ethanol, then it's just happy seals or something like that. Do you remember what I'm talking about?
Yeah, right. So yeah, he's really big on how gasoline and lead gasoline of the past has been really toxic and killing so many people. And you got oil spills and wars over oil in the Middle East and so on. So this is this big narrative. And then he says, well, with ethanol, you have none of these problems. You have domestic production, and also it's super clean. And if you spill ethanol into, the ocean or the river or what, all you get is a happy seal. And then he has this, this seal on a beach, being happy. And this is of course not true, because we know that ethanol kills animals, and it gets, if you have a tanker full of crude oil or tanker full of ethanol, I guess the ethanol will kill the seal actually faster.
Interesting. That would be good to look into. For the new version of the book, I'm going to do some more research on ethanol because and biofuels in general. I'm curious. They are, in some ways, they've become less popular, but there are, I know, for instance, in the realm of jet fuel, there are talks of a low carbon jet fuel, and we can do this using biofuels. With biofuels, there's just this inherent point that I've never heard refuted, which is just that it just tends to be very resource intensive to grow calories. Like to grow calories of any kind, but particularly to grow food calories. And then with most of these biofuels, you're essentially growing food and then using it for fuel. And you're growing food and then processing the food and then using it for fuel, versus with oil, what you're doing is you're taking a naturally plentiful, concentrated, stored source of energy, and you didn't have to grow anything, and you didn't have to process it. I mean, you have to process it some, but it's already processed into quite a potent form. And, it's different than corn, right? There's a lot more distance between corn and fuel than between, crude oil and fuel. So we'll talk about this more in the future, but I'm just curious, Stefan, is that still your impression, or is there some good argument they have against the resource intensity of growing food and then transforming it into machine calories?
Yeah, I think it's still like just the process. It's the material intensity on one hand, but also like a growing season, right? If you have to wait 3 months until the raw material reappears, and then you maybe can plant it once or twice a year, that already in itself is a big cost factor. And of course, you need agricultural land for that. Maybe not exactly the same quality, but often exactly the same quality. I think it's like 40% of corn production in the United States goes into these biofuels. So that's a lot of agricultural land that's used. It wouldn't have to be used otherwise. And so there are a lot of factors that just inherently make this more expensive. And I don't think there's a good fix for that. Maybe GMO crops and better fertilizer, something like that, better technology can improve a bit on that. But they are just underlying processes that make it really expensive.
Good point. One more thought on that. But yeah, so it's a great point about the growing seasons, which had not been top of mind to me at all. But one broader point, which is the just the difference between the potential and the actual. And this is a very broad point that Ayn Rand talks about a lot in different contexts. But in the context of energy and economics, it's just important to recognize there's a difference between the actual ability to produce cheap, plentiful, reliable energy in all of its needed forms versus the claimed potential ability to do it. And part of what happens with an actual ability is that you've solved all of these problems. There are just so many things that, let's say, the oil industry had to solve to reliably deliver jet fuel so that we can fly around all over the place. And we have no idea that there's just so many things that went into that and that were difficult, and just different kinds of systems and logistics and processes and coordination. I mean, who knows what went into it, but the idea is they figured it out. They have a working system. But then when somebody talks about a potential, they don't have to have a working system, and they don't have to have engaged with all these problems. They just have to have a kind of a couple of plausible sounding things like, oh, there was a conspiracy and these oil people had influence in this legislature, and Joe Bob is powering his truck with this stuff, and this other truck could be converted this way, and there's an experiment in a lab with this kind of thing. But it's not actualized, and because it's not actualized, it hasn't there are bound to be innumerable problems that we as onlookers can have really no idea of the extent of. And we know that they can often be deal breakers because most ideas are bad. I mean, most ideas are not workable in the sense of being economically competitive. So our protection against bad potential ideas, which is most statements of potential tend to be bad compared to what the actual thing is. Our protection against it is what Ayn Rand called the separation of state and economics. So the idea that different people can have different ideas about what's the most efficient way for people to produce things. But people are free to compete. And if you have an idea, then you can try to outcompete somebody, but you can't impose your bad potential idea on somebody else. And so what we see with so many of the unreliables and then also the biofuels is people want the ability to impose these potentials on people, and they make these very sketchy arguments for them, but they're not required to actually demonstrate them in reality. And then they're demanding that, well, first we're going to ban the actual thing, and then don't worry, we'll make the potential work. And like, no, you won't, and no, you don't have a right to. Don, what is your next story?
We've talked a lot in past episodes about how New York has barred natural gas pipelines and how this has cut off the Northeast from natural gas supply. But there's actually another blockade going on, and this is from something called the Jones Act. And that's a protectionist law. It's about a century old, that it demands that cargo that's transported between U.S. ports has to be on U.S. built ships, and the crew has to be an American crew. And the problem, or at least one problem with that, is that there aren't enough of these ships that comply with the law in order for us to get liquefied natural gas from the American South to the Northeast to help deal with the fact that they don't have pipeline capacity to bring in natural gas. And Massachusetts, in order to get around this, actually had to import natural gas from, would you believe it, Russia, instead of the United States, which is just this like haven of natural gas. And for a while, it was looking like President Trump was considering waiving the Jones Act, but reportedly has changed his mind, although there's nothing official on it. And there's this concept that economists will talk about called Baptists and bootleggers. And it's that you can often get a unity or a unified front between people who are ideologically opposed or committed to something, and then people who just want to cash in. So, for instance, this is the deprivation of natural gas to the Northeast is you have the green movement that just wants to stop energy, but then you have these crony businessmen in the U.S. shipping world who, in order to protect their prices without having to compete, are holding back our ability to deliver energy, and that it's very hard to overcome that in a situation in which people aren't concerned with freedom, and instead you get these different pressure groups vying for their special restrictions or special favors. And so I think this is I would like to see this waived, but I think more importantly, just having a more broader commitment to freedom so that you're not having to fight these fights in this kind of piecemeal fashion is going to become very vital, because the Northeast is really suffering. They're very vulnerable, particularly we might have time to talk about grid resiliency. They're very vulnerable right now, and a bad winter along with some pipelines breaking down could be really catastrophic. And I think the important long-term game here is to protect their freedom to actually get the energy that they need.
I had never heard that term, Baptists and bootleggers. That is, I mean, that I think applies very, very broadly, in that you have people with certain very strong ideology, particularly, in the case of the Greens, we're talking about something that's anti-industrial, but maybe more relevant is statist. So it necessitates power concentrated in the hands of the government, and then that's always going to invite corrupt people who want to use that power for their own gain. And so the one of the obvious kinds of uses of the power will be to take resources from some people and give them to other people, or restrict some people's freedom in a way that at least somewhat benefits other people, and thus you'll get all of this manipulation. But so one aspect of this that I want to highlight is that I think often the Baptist part of it comes first. That is, the ideology creates a context where it's considered moral for the government to gain a whole bunch of power, and then there are opportunists who will try to do their best to exploit that. But it's when sometimes people just say, "Oh, it's money and it's corruption." But one of the questions is, what ideas made possible that corruption? What gave a moral sanction to that corruption, and really what gave a moral sanction to the power that then the corruption inevitably flows from?
Yeah, well, and one other point to that, because I agree with that 100%. But the other thing is, I think there's a tendency to think that there are no Baptists. In other words, like often I think critics of the Green Movement will portray them as, oh, Al Gore's just trying to get a lot of money from this global warming scam or something like that. But that I think the fact is that, like, what it really does is it prevents you from showing the destructiveness and ultimately the evil of bad ideologies if you just dismiss them as, oh, they're always just an insincere cover up for money making. Like, I think like there are people who really do not value human flourishing, and if you don't recognize that and address that as a premise, then you're not going to be able to actually get anywhere.
Yeah, there's a good lecture by Leonard Peikoff, who's the heir of Ayn Rand and was her top student, and is a philosopher, still alive. And he had a lecture called the Role of Philosophy and Psychology in History. And one thing he dealt with is, what's the relationship between different ideas and different motives. So I don't know if that's available in a book anywhere, but if you look up the role of philosophy and psychology in history, I'm sure you can at least listen to it somewhere for very cheap.
It's online for
or
free,
free?
Alex. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Stefan, what's your next story?
My story is about increasing liquefied natural gas exports to Europe. So, one of the benefits of the US shale boom comes to Europe, although Europe is largely against fracking and tiled oil and gas production. So, interestingly, since 2016, almost by 300%, the natural gas exports from America to Europe have increased. And this is primarily because of some lobbying effort by the US administration, because in direct competition to that American natural gas is the Russian natural gas. So you might have heard about Nord Stream 2, the big pipeline project that seeks to deliver natural gas from Russia directly to Germany. And so now the German government has sort of opened up another option and is supporting a liquefied natural gas import terminal in Germany. So this gives us some options, and that's important geostrategically because we know that Russia uses its state-run oil and gas business to gain leverage over other countries. So it has been very aggressive against Ukraine, where there also was a hot war, of course, and other countries. Poland is very concerned about this business with energy from Russia, and so this is a really good option. I don't know if the government involvement is a really good deal for all of us. So you can see on the American side, the Trump administration has lobbied the European Union and particular countries to open up the markets for that, and also support infrastructure, which is semi-state run or financed by governments. And on the other hand, you have some indecent policy in Europe regarding production of natural gas and oil, and also this trade deal between Russia and European countries with natural gas and primarily natural gas imports. But it's a really good option, and we are over here in Europe where I reside. We get some benefits from the U.S. shale boom, and that's a positive thing. One thing to mention is that the liquefied natural gas, of course, is a bit more expensive, mostly because liquefied natural gas has to be liquefied. It has to be cooled and compressed to become a liquid, and that's much more expensive than using a pipeline from Russia to get the natural gas in. But so it's supposed to be a 20% additional cost of the gas. But considering the geostrategic importance of having this option, I think it could be worth it. But of course, the green activists, particularly in America, want to stop these exports. So there's a keep it in the ground alliance. I think it's something like I forgot the name of the top organization there, but it's like Water Safety or something like that. So they are demanding that these exports are actually banned between America and Europe. And I don't know what they are thinking, because I don't think natural gas from Russia will be somehow greener or less CO2 intensive. I can imagine that.
So in terms of just natural gas, what's the shale potential in Europe that they could get way cheaper gas than the Russian gas?
I don't have any concrete numbers, and I don't think the potential is fully known, because, for example, in Germany, I know in particular because I'm a German, and I know this from news items, there's a moratorium on fracking. So you could do explorational wells in Germany, but nobody's going to apply for that. So we don't even know what the real potential is. There's some potential. I think there's definitely something in Northern England. There's some potential in Germany. I don't know about the other countries, but there must be some at least opportunity to find out. But even the exploration business isn't really developed here. It's so hostile, the environment.
Got it. Don, what's your next story?
So I was reading a Washington Post story where that headline announced the first solar powered town. And I was really curious because, I mean, unless they were going to sleep at 5 p.m., it would not be very plausible that this town could run solely on solar.
5 p.m. That's not going to work very well either. It's the angle of the sun is not going to be too hospitable. But anyway, yeah, continue.
Yeah, and so I looked into it a bit, and turns out it's a town of called Babcock Ranch. About 400 people live there in Florida, and the bunch of the town buildings have solar panels. But the major thing is that they have this solar field that's apparently has the power to energize, capture enough energy to power 15,000 homes. And to be fair, the quote from the Florida Power and Light spokesperson sort of gave away what was going on. She said that when the sun is shining, folks are getting emission-free energy. We can't say exactly where the electrons go, but they're going to Babcock Ranch and beyond. So what's really happening is that this solar field is actually going into this whole Florida Power and Light grid, and that is how residents of this town are actually getting their energy. And so I went and looked up the Florida Power and Light grid, and that is 70% natural gas, 23% nuclear, 4% coal, 3% purchase power, and at least as of December 2016, which is their latest numbers, no percentage of solar. So if you look at the specific numbers in terms of capacity, there's 22,305 megawatts of capacity for that entire grid. And Babcock Ranch, the solar energy center, provides 74.5 megawatts of capacity, or 0.3% of the total capacity. And that's not generation.
I wouldn't even, even though that's strong there, I wouldn't use that. Like, just because even it's, so it's like 0.3%, but even like 0.3%. Yeah. So we got to figure out better consistent terminology for this capacity stuff.
So basically, the bottom line is that this is a town that has spent a lot of money on solar panels that actually don't give it any usable energy.
Yeah, I mean, just even why not just take it as, a giant wind turbine? Like not that I have a house, or that I own, but or that I'd be allowed to. But like, if you build a giant wind turbine that, I don't know, costs a ton of money on your property, yes, obviously you can generate more energy than you use in some sense. But then there are issues with, then that's not everyone can do that because the wind turbines need to be spaced out. So it's just this. It's sort of a caricature of the opposition and a caricature of themselves, because the whole idea is no. The question is, can you produce plentiful power on demand using the technology? That's the game. So as I've said before, it needs to be self-sustaining or self-sufficient solar. And if it's not, then great. You can generate a whole bunch of unreliable power that then is a pain for everyone to deal with and doesn't actually solve the problem that you claim you're trying to solve. Stefan, I have a quick technical question, which is just, isn't it wrong to say, when they say we can't say exactly where electrons go, but they're going to Babcock Ranch and beyond? Is that really a good description of electricity?
I don't think so. So electricity, of course, is very complicated because we are dealing with an electromagnetic field, which doesn't behave like a liquid or a gas or something like that. So it's very difficult actually you can't measure where the electrons come from and where the charge flows and so on. So it's really, you can just think of it as a big pool of some physical unit, and then you get a fraction of that.
But isn't it the because the idea of this, I think, is people think it's just like electrons are kind of shooting through like drops of water.
No,
through a pipe.
That's not how it works. So they are sort of. I'm not a physicist, so it's very difficult to explain, and for a physicist, it would be difficult to explain, I think. So it's just they are sort of, I think, swinging in the electromagnetic field, and so the charge run through that. So I don't I can really explain the basic physics of that, but it's very complicated and it's not easy to measure or see where it flows. So actually, so when the solar panels produce a lot of energy, it's actually that a lot of these electrons or of the charge is sort of pushed out of there because you have a sort of potential difference between the generator and the consumer. And then if you're connected to the power grid and the generator is generating this electricity, it actually flows out of there in a sense. So it's very difficult. You can't measure that. I don't know anyone who could measure that. Maybe under laboratory conditions. I don't know.
Don, what's your next story?
That was mine.
Oh, you passed the test. Stefan, what's your next story?
So I've noticed some contradictions in the new French green energy policy. So late April, France has sort of announced a new green energy law, and that will demand that the entirety of France will be carbon neutral by 2050. And compared to the current goal of only quartering the emissions by that point. And it wants to phase out coal and decrease CO2 emissions across all sectors. But interestingly, one item was that it will delay the phase out of nuclear. So currently, the law demands that by 2025, the French nuclear generation, which produces something above 70% of French electricity, will be reduced to 50% of French electricity. And now the new law supposes to delay that and bring it down to 50% by 2035, 10 years later. And I find this quite interesting because it is essentially admits that the renewable generation that is supposed to replace nuclear and coal and so on cannot actually do that. Because I think the French government realized that if we are reducing nuclear power, which is sort of the bread and butter power generator, then we cannot do that. Then we cannot replace that with solar and wind because they are intermittent, and that would cause a lot of problems integrating that and keep the reliability up. And now they are like pushing backwards the nuclear phase out, which is interestingly a centerpiece of French policy. I don't know why that. You can explain that by a sort of rational policy to reduce CO2 emissions, because nuclear, obviously, especially already existing nuclear capacity, would be a really good base to start from if you want to reduce CO2 emissions in the power sector. But you can only see this as through the lens of politics and a public that is sort of misinformed by green ideology. And in addition to reducing CO2, also wants to get rid of nuclear power. So France is sort of the leading country in the world with nuclear power generation, and it absolutely makes no sense for them, under the goal of CO2 emission reductions, to just retire its reactors. I don't see any good reason for that. And the French government essentially said, okay, we can have 2025. That would require us to install more gas-fired power plants, and that would ruin our CO2 emission goals.
Yeah, and it just is a pure example of how the standard that's being used is not any kind of pro-human standard. It's just this idea of being natural. And so renewable is considered natural and nuclear is considered unnatural. So even though nuclear is an actual way of lowering CO2 emissions and producing a lot of power for a lot of people, it is being attacked, and they're prioritizing attacking something that's actually doing the job that they say needs to be done all over the place, that's being done so little, which is essentially CO2 free power. And then they're going to go to the thing that's failing to do that all over the place. Don, let's take one more story from each of you. Don, what's your last story today?
Sure. So this is one of the concerns about intermittent renewables is, often we talk about the way in which they make energy expensive, but I think a more catastrophic problem, or at least an equally disturbing one, is how vulnerable they can make us to blackouts and brownouts, particularly as we become more dependent on them. And this is basically the issue of resiliency. How able is the grid to deal with adverse events like severe weather? And I was reading former Power Hour guest Judith Curry on her blog was summarizing a presentation by Vice Admiral Lee Gunn um, from the Navy, who was talking about grid resiliency. And he actually argued that wind and solar can improve grid resilience from drought risks. And so he makes this point that droughts can be a major contributor to electric power disruptions because you need, for instance, water from rivers and other sources to cool coal and nuclear, and that renewable sources don't depend on water, and so that they can augment power generation during times of drought. And I was curious what I had never thought of that point, and so I was asked you guys what you thought of it, and Stefan had some really interesting things to say about it. So eager to hear you share those with everyone else, Stefan.
Yeah, so one interesting thing there was that this diversity concept was mentioned, and so you want an essentially all of the above strategy for power generation. I don't think that's true. I think you have plenty of examples where we talked about France, where you have one source of power, very reliably generating power and making the system work. So you don't necessarily want diversity, but there could be situations where particularly in dry areas where you don't have cooling capacity, and if your power plant requires cooling from a river or a lake or even the ocean, um, then of course that's an important feature built into that, but that's in the planning phase of the power plant that has to be considered. So if you don't foresee that, for example, a large river that's cooling your coal or nuclear power plant might dry up in a year in the future, then of course you will have a big problem and you can run that power plant. But there are ways around that. Of course, you can, in the planning phase, you can use a different cooling system, something that recycles water and doesn't evaporate it, but recovers a lot of the water vapor and cools it down in cooling towers and so on. And you can see, particularly with nuclear, that is being built right now on the Arabian Peninsula, right? So that's essentially a desert region, and you can use maybe the ocean water, but you can have very dry conditions, and you can essentially devise a water system, a water cooling system that works even under extreme conditions. And that's only talking about the current sort of light water standard reactor that we see being built or already built today. But future technologies definitely don't suffer from that, particularly in nuclear, where you essentially can run it without a big water body. You can have a different cooling system that maybe work with air or something like that, or smaller reactors that don't have that much excess heat and so on. And it's more of a planning issue. I think it's not so much that if we build this type of power plant, we definitely will run into cooling problems. No, it's a planning problem. If you can foresee certain weather conditions in the future, then you can say, okay, we need this kind of cooling system that deals with that. And maybe that's a bit more expensive, than just having reliable water supply in certain areas. But I don't think that's a deal breaker.
Yeah, I mean, I wish we were in an energy conversation where solar and wind were being raised as in the context of, okay, these technologies have a lot of limitations, but where could they be a net positive? Or is it good to use solar for extra air conditioning in the middle of the day in Dubai, that kind of thing. And then, solar for certain off-grid uses. Um, and that would be a fine thing, but we're so much in the context where these are being positioned as mass substitutes slash replacements for fossil fuels and for nuclear. And there, the number one thing that needs to be said is that is not the case. That is a baseless claim, and that they've proved so far, at least, incredibly bad for baseload power, and there's every reason to think that's going to continue for a long time, if not forever. So the first thing that needs to be said about these is just that the whole solar and wind movement is a movement that's not driven by human flourishing. It's driven by this renewable ideology, which is really a species of green ideology. And then beyond that, you have to look at, when could these actually be useful? But then you can't make the mistake of acting like, oh, these other technologies that we use now, they're just completely at the mercy of certain kinds of weather and climate patterns. And so I appreciate, Stefan, you pointing out that it's not just that we're helpless with these technologies to deal with those things. And in general, just with climate and weather these days, there's just this expectation that if we operate with it a certain way and then something changes, then our lives are going to get worse because we're going to stay static. And that's just a false view of life, because almost nothing in our lives is static, particularly in a modern society. One aspect of a modern society where there's so much freedom and so much opportunity is that your environment in a much is really the human environment is so dynamically changing in so many different ways. You even think about, for instance, where you would live, and where you live is going to be dependent upon, unfortunately, political factors. But even without political factors, economic factors, and this industry was needed. The buggy whip industry was needed, and that was located one place, but then that's no longer a useful industry, and so the opportunity is somewhere else. So you move with people, and there's just also the whole human environment is already a dynamic thing. So we're used to changing in all sorts of different ways, to not doing things the same way. And thus, different kinds of changes in climate, that even if they were anywhere near as significant as people are saying, those are the kinds of changes that we deal with all the time. An example I got from Ayn Rand was, I think I got it from her. I think George Reisman also uses this, but just the phenomenon of the population of England tripling in the 1800s in some very short window of time. You think about, what is it like to adapt to that? That's a lot more dramatic than the kind of sea level rises we see, or different storm pattern changes we see. And yet there's this false view of human beings as these static beings. And really, I think it connects to the view that they're parasites. And thus, all these wrong expectations, even for a given change in nature, in the rest of nature, there's just this totally false view of human beings will just stupidly do the exact same thing repetitively and then drop like flies. All right, Stefan, one more story. What do you want to talk about?
I want to talk about uranium quotas in America. And so the Trump administration, of course, has recently made headlines with bailouts for struggling coal and nuclear power plants. And now 2 American producers of uranium fuel, Energy Fuels and Ur-Energy, that's UR apparently for uranium energy, have filed what's called a Section 232 petition with the US Department of Commerce to investigate the impact of uranium impacts on national security. So they allege that uranium is a strategic commodity, and that's important for U.S. Power generation, of course, but also for the strategic defense of America, and therefore it deserves some special protection from foreign competition. And in particular, producers like Russia and I think Uzbekistan is who they mentioned. They have state-run companies that provide the uranium fuel, and they might play politics with that and have a big stake in American power generation and also defense issues there. But I looked into the numbers, and what I found curious is that yeah, it's true that only 7% of uranium supplies for power plants came from the United States domestically. So a lot of imports for the US nuclear reactor fleet. But the majority of imports actually came from Australia and Canada. And I don't think you can argue that Australia and Canada will threaten the strategic security of America. So since the 1980s, domestic production in the United States went down significantly, but I think it's a competitive market actually for the fuel. And I don't see a real strategic problem there. So I believe this is purely protectionism, and therefore I think we should oppose that.
All right. Makes sense. I buy it. Not much to add there. So good topics today. Thanks for sharing those, guys. Audience, if you'd like to get in touch with us, our designated point person is Don. You can email him at don@industrialprogress.net with any questions, comments, love mail, or hate mail. You can also email him if you would like to book one of our speakers, including me, Don, or Stefan, for your next event. And you can also message him if you are an organization that would like some help with its messaging and taking advantage of our different consulting services. To get on the mailing list, we'll have a new episode out on Wednesday, and basically every Wednesday, and a new issue of the newsletter out on Wednesday. Go to alexepsteinlist.com and subscribe. That's it this week. We'll be back next week with some more great stories. Until then, I'm Alex Epstein. This has been Power Hour.
Power Hour. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of energy. Power Hour. The antidote to shallow thinking about energy issues.